and go home in peace.
Hello everybody and welcome to the second dialogue of the Città Visibili cities. I'm Alessia Gasparini, contributor at the Italian weekly magazine Left and moderator of the entire cycles of the three dialogues. Thanks to Fondazione Feltrinelli to having me. During the last months, economic insecurity, abandonment and loneliness have more than ever influenced the individual and collective life. Social, environmental and economic injustices have increased as a result of the pandemic crisis. How to get out of the status of survival that spread over territories, cities, and inhabitants during the pandemics. How the needs and aspirations of young citizens, women, families, and workers can be heard, seen, and taken into account in order to rethink and redesign human, livable, and sustainable cities for all. The pandemic has emphasized the limits and fragility of the city and the people's lifestyles. These vulnerabilities increased the social, environmental, and economic crises that many people were already facing before the COVID-19. Ecological crises, social injustice, and economic crises have overlapped over the years, exacerbating fractures and polarization of communities, highlighting inequalities and issues of access to basic service and resources. The impact of the pandemic has, on the one hand, opened the eyes of many on the deficits of inclusion, care, sustainability, and justice of the territories we inhabit, and on the other hand, has mobilized action, practices, projects that have shown on the face of solidarity society. A society that is able to offer concrete answers to the community, intercept needs, and create appropriate networks of intervention from grassroots level. Through the voice of 6 international cities, the Città Visibili cities intend to give voice to those points of view, experiences, needs, answers, and solutions that can contribute to imagine new forms of cities that are just, worthy, livable, and sustainable, and to frame the cities in which we would like to live. This cycle is composed by 3 dialogues on the topics social housing and right to housing, economic fragility and right to work, and environmental fragility and right to health. Today we will talk about economic fragility and right to work with the cities of Athens with Ms. Maria Stratikaki and the city of Mumbai with Ms. Sheila Patel. While in the third dialogue we will speak about environmental fragility and right to health, and we will hear the experiences of the city of Bogota with Mr. Enrique Peñalosa and the city of Dhaka with Ms. Fahmida Khatoum. The first one of our dialogues was about social housing and the right to housing, and heard the experience of the city of Sao Paulo with Ms. Teresa Herling and Bien with Mr. Christian Chantal. After these 3 appointments online, the reflection and some of the conclusion of the cycle will be brought this autumn to the Broken City camp that will take place on 8th and 9th October. In fact, the 2 days camp aims to identify a set of actions, propositions, policies and practices that could contribute in addressing the challenges of a city that has been broken. The 2 days event will see researchers, activists, practitioners and city makers selected with a European call for proposal debating about city challenges in thematic workshops, lectures, and moments of public restitutions with high-level speakers that aim to identify practices, solutions, and their condition of implementation for the future agenda of the cities and territories. After the camp, another key appointment where we will bring the legacy of Città Visibili cities will be the international colloquium The Politics to Come on December 10th and 11th. During this international initiative, the economic, social, and territorial reconstruction scenarios elaborating during the whole year at Fondazione Feltrinelli will be discussed. The main goal is the creation of a new progressive and ecological political platform. Before introducing our guest, please note that a researcher of Fondazione Feltrinelli will collect any questions that you might have and write both on YouTube and on Facebook on the official channels and pages of the Foundation. And now, let's talk about today's main topic, the combination between abandonment and trust and economic fragilities and right to work. The COVID-19 pandemic have changed a lot of aspects of our lives, in our homes, but most of all in our cities, in the way in which we live them. If before the pandemic a lot of us worked in offices, now smart working is something very common. That means living all day, not out and about, but into our house. But there is an aspect of the problem that is much more severe. The constant loss of jobs that distract a lot of people, mainly women and young workers. The pandemic has widened the gaps and inequalities that characterize society in the 2020s, be they due to gender, class, or ethnicity. Now more than ever, the human being needs to be at the center of the politics, as we never forgot to remind on Left magazine. Living in a city that doesn't consider the fragilities of its inhabitants is a major issue for the most vulnerable subjects. Between them, there are for sure women, particularly the ones who are forced to live with a violent partner. The lack of possibility to go out of the house due to the pandemic spread is a risk factor for domestic violence and femicides, but also for violence witnessed by children. Returning to the work topic, as we can see in these charts, only in Milan, 89,000 people over the age of 15 have been look for work in 2020. Moreover, in Lombardy, we can see, 17.4% of young people between 15 and 29 are neets. That means neither in employment nor in education training. They don't study and it doesn't work. Looking at the next chart, we can see that in the whole Italy, neets are 23.3% of the young people, which means more than 2 million subjects. As we mentioned earlier, women are the most struck by layoffs. 98% of unemployed in Italy in 2020 are women. The pandemic has hit women more because the main burden of the care work is on them, and it has become even greater in a year when the closure of schools led children and young people to be forced to study from home, with a more than legitimate need to be followed in the learning process that, in the absence of teachers, was fulfilled within the home. What is the situation in the cities we are going to visit today, Athens and Mumbai? What are the similitudes and what the difference between Milan? We will talk about it today with our guest when preparing to introduce you. But first, let me introduce you our discussant, Stefania Sabatinelli from DASTU of Politecnico di Milano, connected from Fondazione Feltrinelli headquarters. The discussant will intervene at the end of our debate to help us draw a line that closes the circle of trends that we will analyze, trying to imagine a concrete solution that can be applied to the city of Milan. Hello, Ms. Sabatinelli, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Perfect. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you our speakers of today, Ms. Maria Stratigaki, connected from Athens, who is a former vice mayor for social solidarity, welfare and equality in the city of Athens, and Ms. Sheila Patel, Director Society for Promotion of Area Resources Center, SPARC, Chair Slum Dwellers International, but also from Mumbai. Welcome you both, and thank you for being here today with us.
We thank you.
Mr. Tigaki, please look with me and our audience at the first card of our debate of today. Can you explain to us what is represented in this picture and answer to the first question of the debate? After a year of pandemic, it's very clear that the conditions are not equal for everybody. In your opinion, who are the most vulnerable subjects nowadays in Italy that are experiencing more economic and social inequalities made even more serious by the outbreak of pandemic? And what are the greatest needs and challenges for these subjects? Thank you.
Yes, I will try to respond to all your questions. The photo we saw is not the usual image of women in Athens. However, it is an image that we see more and more in our city. There are thousands of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan who came to Athens during the last 5 years. Most of them traveled to North European countries for better life and work. Some thousands remained in Athens and tried to integrate in the Greek society. Athens is the easiest city to integrate in Greece. In fact, we have received and mostly integrated thousands of economic migrants in the 90s. Looking at Muslim women in the photo, I have to say that all women living in the city have met serious problems during the COVID pandemic. The largest challenges for all Greek women is due to the long lockdowns and the remote work men and women had to do. They faced two challenges. One is the extra care responsibilities created by the closing of schools. In Greece, schools closed for longer time than in other European countries. And these extra tasks, care tasks, unequally shared between women and men, unfortunately. There are strong gender stereotypes in Greece regarding domestic work and tasks for the care of the dependent, children, elderly, and so on. Both are supposed to be female tasks. The second challenge are the more risks for domestic violence against women due to the long duration of lockdowns, as it happened everywhere in the world. The number of the calls to the SOS telephone line for violence were tripled in 1 month after the lockdown. So refugee women are even more vulnerable as they had to delay their way to integration due to the pandemic because schools for refugee children were also closed. Public spaces were not accessible, and being pushed at home does not facilitate their integration. Despite long-lasting women and feminist movements, Greece is a male-dominated country in politics, decision-making, and the labor force. We are the last in performance among European countries in the European Index for Gender Equality. The pandemic has aggravated this situation, both regarding the burden of paid and unpaid care work and the incidence of violence. The number of femicides have increased and feminist demonstrations have started again after a long time. The pandemic has limited the right to work and the right to safety and the free access to public space. All these elements, work, safety, public space, are very important for the whole process of integration, both for native women and the newcomers in the city. Employment and paid work need an open economy, even more when in Athens unemployment rate is high as at this very moment. When the right to work does not exist, the economic fragility becomes a usual pattern. Economic fragility does not support gender equality, as all we know very well. The right to work for refugee women is even more difficult, is a more difficult objective. They have to overcome even stronger stereotypes and go out to work. The right to work for refugee women is not even a common demand. It is an almost untouchable dream. Maybe we, the women of your photo, would agree with.
Thank you, Mr. Tikaki. Now we can go, I will look at the second card and we can go on with the second question. At the light of this aggravation due to COVID-19 spread, have new measures been put in place by city manager or policymakers to contrast economic fragilities? Or are there any practices implemented by civil societies, by communities or by grassroots movements that make up for the lack of actions from city managers and that could give new solutions to the economic and social welfare of these groups? Please.
Okay, yes, the picture is a demonstration. A demonstration is a way to ask for your rights for work, for equality, for safety, for a violence-free society, for condemning crimes like femicides, for asking for social justice. Recent demonstrations in the city of Athens were against also other things, like the new law that brings police in the universities, against the law that obliges compulsory sharing of custody and home for children after a divorce, against the new laws for flexibility of working hours and lower protection of work rights in the after-COVID era. Recent demonstrations were organized also over the current, with a delay of 5 years, movement in Greece. After the declaration of an Olympic gold medalist, a woman champion, who declared that she was raped 25 years ago by a powerful man of her sport association official committee. This declaration has initiated similar declarations from other women in arts, sports, and other contexts. So, practices by Greek state and the Athens municipality and NGOs for tackling women victims of violence and practices by the Greek state and the Athens municipality for tackling women victims of violence and aggression include shelters and counseling centers and campaigns and the telephone line and all these nice instruments to support women victims of violence. The city of Athens already provided free legal services for women victims of violence and opened a new counseling center for all aspects of women's problems in the everyday life for women residents, Greek, migrants, and refugees. Feminist organizations with funding from philanthropic foundations and international organizations target specifically to help refugee women still living in camps and apartments of the city of Athens provided by the municipality. Boosting women's access to the labor market is also a way to reinforce women, independent women, and potential liberation from dominant gender norms regarding family and human relations. Practices in the field include counseling and support through training, language learning refugees, and the provision of childcare by the municipalities. Also, the municipal centers for the elderly are very, very useful for providing a place for recreation and socialization of older women and men. NGOs, private foundations, and international organizations are crucial in filling the gaps of the state and the municipal structures. Solidarity movements grown up in Athens during the recent economic crisis have been useful also for the reception of large numbers of refugees and filled up the gaps that less prompt responses could be provided by the formal public agencies. I strongly believe that efficient practices for tackling urgent and needs, economic and social, especially in periods of crisis like the pandemic, need to be based in close collaboration of all available agents in the public, the private, in the volunteer sector, in all of us who live in this very city of Athens.
Perfect. Thank you, Ms. Stratigaki. And now let's make a big jump to Mumbai by Sheila Patel, Director Society for Promotion of Area Resources Center, Chase Slum Dwellers International. Ms. Patel, hello. Let's look together at your first card, the first picture of your city. Can you explain this picture and say to us, in your opinion, who are the most vulnerable and fragile subjects experiencing more economic and social inequality in Mumbai, conditions worsened by the pandemic crisis, and what are the greatest needs and challenges for these people?
Okay. So when you see this picture, you see a city that is seriously divided in two parts. You see the backdrop of the formal city, which is high-rise, and then you see this flat area in the front with little squares, which are blue and white, which are the roofs of the houses of people who live in what we call slums or informal settlements. They reflect the historical development of cities in which the elite, both colonial and indigenous, lived in the formal city, and people who migrated from the villages or from the outskirts to service them lived informally. And the city has never reconciled the right to habitat, to basic amenities, to services, to transport, and to minimum wage labor for these communities. So you have intergenerational impoverishment, where minimum standards of water, of sanitation, of open public spaces, or education and health is accessible to these populations as compared to those who live formally. And this is the plight of not only Mumbai, which is one of the largest metropolitan regions of India. The city of Mumbai has 12 million plus people, and the metropolitan region has 18 million people. So this picture, I hope, will show you the serious volumes of inequality and inadequate services that were there for several decades, in fact centuries, before COVID hit us. And so what you have is that COVID has opened out the serious development deficits that exist, where both global and local minimum standards have not been acknowledged. And a very good example is the challenges that all of us as social activists within these communities and the NGOs and civil societies that worked with them faced when we started dealing with COVID in around March of 2020, during which time there was inadequate, there was no water to wash your hands. There were no safe places for children to get out of their houses. Most of these houses are less than 30 square meters in which 8 to 10 people live. Now imagine that even if that household had one cell phone, it had to address the challenges of the earning members, whether they would get informal wages to transport food and services to the elite city even during lockdown, whether it was available for children who were locked up in their homes, who may, if they were lucky, have schools sending them digital studies, and the immense crisis that women faced, because not only do they all have to work, but they have to be caretakers, they have to manage these children at home, and they have to look after not only their family, but their whole neighborhood collectively. So the challenges that these households face is terrible and unimaginable. And most of these are first, second, and third generation migrants. They house the most recent migrants, and if any of you had seen on international television, you would have seen that there were thousands upon thousands of people who had come for just transient migration to work in the cities and go home, suddenly finding that the lockdown had completely stopped their wage earning capacity, even though they were not minimum wages, they were living in terrible conditions, and most of them were subtenants in these informal settlements. And many of them started a journey to cross their state borders on their feet because there was no public transport. So there's a competition of whose situation was the worst. But I would say that the migrants, both individuals, households, men, women, young girls, was the worst, and then all these households. And their situation has been exacerbated by the fact that the per capita availability of medical is in general, but those in relationship to this particular challenge of COVID has completely and totally destroyed their sense of dependency, security, and trust on duty bearers like their city and the state. And it's also important for people who are not from the global south to acknowledge that the situation in Mumbai and the larger metropolitan regions, although they have many, many more people living informally, at least there are some semblances of secondary and tertiary hospitals and some infrastructure that the city can provide. But the plight of the medium and small towns is much, much worse. And that is because those cities themselves and those towns themselves have very little money, very little capacity, and they have completely developed an inability to respond to the needs of the communities. So those locations where there are local activists linked to NGOs, linked to civil society institutions, their situation is better off than those in which there are no organized communities. And so there is this huge evidence of what the Oxfam poverty report showed earlier in January this year, which said that whether it's local or global, less than 10% people own 70% of the assets in those localities, regions, continents, and globally. And so those are the challenges that the COVID process has completely exposed. And there's a lot of rhetoric of the new normal, to build back better, to link development and climate change together. But these very fundamental deficits, which are multi-decadal and sometimes centuries old, need a radical shift in how development investment is going to be made.
Thanks, Ms. Patel. Now we can move on to the next card. And I would like to ask you, after the outbreak of the pandemic, have new measures been put in place by city manager or policymakers to contrast the economic fragilities? Or are there any practices implemented by civil societies, by communities, or by grassroots movements that make up for the lack of actions from city managers and that could give new solutions to the economic and social welfare of these groups?
So first, let me explain that photograph. We saw all the militancy and the civil unrest that we saw in the pictures of Milan and, in Athens and your earlier pictures. This picture is very interesting. These two pipes, they are like 10, 15 feet in diameter. They go through that informal settlement, that town which I was talking about, which has 500,000 people living there. It's water that comes into the city. It goes through these informal settlements, but until 1970, 1980, this water was not available to communities. And despite them asking for it, they never got it. So their way of protest was that a group of people broke into these pipes, put pumps, and served water to the communities. In the process, all the filth that you see around here went into those pipes, and the city had jaundice as a pandemic in the city. And it was after that gradually drinking water was made accessible to informal settlements. And the reason I'm telling you this is the form of protest, the form of dissent is very different in our situation, because we don't have fundamental entitlements that are available to people living informally. So these kinds of acts produce those things in the past. Evictions which could not clear the space helped communities get some land security. Defecation that polluted drinking water because people didn't have toilets got them toilets. So what I want to say is that the form of dissent, the form of getting access, has been through different forms of protests. Most of these protests were initiated by women, but they aggregated into large numbers of people making these demands. And over a period of time, we see an interesting phenomena in the city, which we call Mumbai as the city of migrants. There is nobody in this city who was there before 1800 except the fisher folk. There were 6 villages, which were fisher folk villages, which then became this large metropolitan area after the British East India Company took over this place because of the port. So coming back to understanding the challenges, traditionally in India, there are no amenities and services that are provided universally to informal settlements. They come in drips and drops. So some settlements have some things, some don't. And one of the things that my organization, which is associated with the social movement that works in about 70 of the most urbanized states in India. India has 29 states, and it has over 5,000 large, medium, and small towns, with Mumbai being the largest industrial metropolitan region, is that you have an amazing contradiction between work ethics, which are amazing in the whole city, and inequality. You have a situation where you have some of the best hospitals in the country, but hardly any preventive, promotive, or primary health care. Yet if you compare it with the rest of India, with the rest of the global south, the municipality provides more education, more health services than others. So there's these contradictions in which we live, that there are some locations which have some facilities that communities have accessed, but by and large, they are not uniformly available at the ratio that is needed. And this became very evident during the COVID period. So we are right now, as we speak, in the worst situation in the COVID spikes that we have faced. And the informal settlements face the consequence of that more than anybody else, because most of them work in the informal economy. Most of them depend on their weekly, daily, and monthly wages, which are eroded. And those of them who are taking courage in their hands to participate in the service delivery, from Amazon to local food deliveries, are also facing the consequences of infections. So in this terrible mix of contradictions, you have amazing local initiatives where, despite these processes, in many areas, community women identify the challenges that are faced by their communities, and through their networks attempt to get the city and the local politicians to work together with them to provide food to those whose wages can no longer help them buy food, to help those people who have COVID to get ambulance services, to go to the hospitals, to develop their own forms of bubbles. You know, I don't know if you have the same terminology, but most of these informal settlements have little lanes on two sides of which there are houses. And more communities block the edges of those areas so that their households are protected. Their children can play in the lanes that are the only open spaces available for 2 and 3 children in a family of 6 to 10 who live in 30 square meters to step out of their homes. And people have to go to the edge of their houses to get services. Vendors of vegetables, of amenities, of different food and requirements, which were earlier not permitted by the municipality, are now the main lifesavers of this whole city. And so many informal systems that were not acknowledged, not permitted, not recognized, have now become part of the foot soldiers that are fighting COVID today. And I think that they are helping all of us to link not only the past deficits to what happens during a pandemic, but to anticipate the real changes that need to be taken if and when we are able to move freely, where we are able to go beyond the pandemic. But the most interesting part of this pandemic that history teaches us is that almost a century ago, the city of Mumbai faced plague. It was a global incident because through the ships and the transport, this plague went to other areas. But like all the past epidemics, this was not a planetary pandemic like this one is. But it also demonstrated all the lockdown systems, the general carelessness of government not to look at the needs of the poorest first. And those are all the lessons that all of us are learning. But we all know that ultimately we have to get the duty bearers and the communities to work together. The volumes that we need to address are too huge for just civil society or the state to handle.
Perfect.
So we have big challenges in front of us.
Thank you, Ms. Patel. And very clear and very interesting. Now we can take another big jump and come back to Athens for the last segment of our debate. And Ms. Patel little anticipated our last theme with the perspective for the future. And so far we talked about the very difficult present of these two cities and their inhabitants. And now we can give ourselves hopefully a breath of fresh air thinking about the future. And Ms. Radigagi, we look at your third and last card now. And I would like to ask you what kind of future the people you talk about a short while ago will face if their needs and challenges are not fulfilled. And talking more about the city itself, what we have to expect if no action is taken, or at the contrary, which kind of city of the future can be imagined by answering the needs of these subjects.
Thank you. It's easier to talk about perspectives and dreams than to analyze the reality. It shows a clear picture of the Athenian landscape, its size, a city center overbuilt, a city without much open space and green space, as you see from the photo. However, I think that the city of Athens is friendly for its residents, the old and the new ones. Athens is a city that provides opportunities for living outside, not only because we have a very nice weather, but also because it is a city without ghetto and important ethnic segregations. Migrant women and men, especially from Albania, who arrived 20 and 25 years ago, have been integrated in the city, and they mostly stay in the center of the city. Not in the suburbs, as it happens in most other European large cities. So they are closer to the Greek citizens. Athens tend to be a multicultural city. That's why nowadays women refugees with a veil that we saw in the first photo are accepted despite the very, very severe crisis in the city faced by the pandemic. Nevertheless, the city has to be much improved. The city has to acquire more public space, parks, free cultural and social events in the streets, in the squares, in all the neighborhoods of the city of Athens. The use of public space is an important means for integration, for equality, for coexistence, and for solidarity. So open and free use of the public space is important for the well-being of everybody, of different social groups, from different economic backgrounds. Car-free and better public free transport is also a dream for residents of the large cities. The same for Athens. The role of the municipality is important in organizing the city in terms of transport and culture and social support. The perspective of a city with less aggressivity in the streets, more social services for the vulnerable people, better childcare facilities and schools for everybody, for all different children who live in the city, is what we all dream, old and new residents. Tourism in Athens is very, very important, and the municipality does a lot to support it. It brings life and money to the city. However, regulations have to be set up in order to avoid increases in rents and basic services, in order to avoid risks for going against social cohesion and quality of the everyday life of the residents, women and men. I am optimist that in the after-COVID area, the economic recovery, it is very important, the economic recovery and resilient plan funded by the European Union will be used to improve in the city all this infrastructure and the way we live everyday life. I hope it will increase access and availability in public space and public cultural and social events, and they will create more space free of violence, more safe, less police in the streets, but more nice life. I dream of a city in which migrants and refugees will be not a threat, but an asset for the city. A city where women and men enjoy equal rights in the public sphere, but also in the private sphere, in their homes. Let's hope that the recent pandemic will leave afterwards only the very small positive changes that it brought for all of us, women and men. Changes in human relations, in social solidarity, in coexistence, and in the tolerance of the difference. Through difficult times, we may have some positive effects, and this is what I hope, and I am confident that it will happen to Athens.
Thank you, Ms. Stratigaki. Now we go back to Ms. Patel. And would you like to explain your last card that we are going to see?
This is the
And
morning
sorry,
cloud.
just a second, and tell us about your forecast of a future Mumbai in which the needs of its inhabitants are fulfilled, or in the worst scenario, ignored. Please, thank you.
Okay. So, because you only allowed me to have 3 photographs, I cannot show you the iconic building, which is a UNESCO heritage building, which used to be called the Victoria Terminus. It looks like those, all those beautiful stations in London, but 10 times bigger. This is what the crowd looks like every morning coming to work from all parts of the city on this station. So through the day, this is what the platforms look like. And this represents 85% of the transport access in the city, while the city invests 75 to 80% of its transport budget on flyovers for 5% of the people who block all the roads. So this is the contradiction that I want to start with. So the first contradiction is that we have, in fact, the best suburban railway transport in the country. It covers most of the public transport for the people, yet the city invests more money on road widening for cars that are owned by 5 to 8% of the people. So this is the city of contrasts. There are more apartment building houses that are locked than anywhere else in our country, and our real estate value of formal housing stock is like all the big metros all over the world. So, and the last contradiction is that India in general and our cities in particular have now more people who are below the age of 30 than above it. So you have a huge population of young people who have the potential of becoming global citizens, having global aspirations, having global values, locked up in physical spaces, in educational disqualification, lack of access to jobs, and perpetuated informality. And so the youth dividend can become a youth disaster very quickly. So that's one. The second very important thing is all southern countries are obsessed with getting attractive foreign direct investment. A lot of it is from the US, UK, and Europe. And they're trying to create Indian cities that can host this process. While in reality, our diaspora sends more money than foreign direct investment. Yet the cities are designed The formal cities are designed to be Wi-Fi connected with, which could look like any European capital with glass buildings which are climatically dysfunctional in our heat. So we are facing huge contradictions in the urbanization that is happening in our cities. And the focus is moving away from universalization of amenities and services. And a deep, almost what we in India, because we were our colonial history is linked to Britain, this Victorian imagery that you should make the poor go back to the villages and make the cities functional for the formal city, which is not happening. It's never going to happen. In fact, the situation is going to get worse. So COVID has shown us all the huge deficits that all our cities are facing in the global south in general, but Mumbai shows it in a glaring volume. But it has amazing resilience. Now, that resilience needs to be converted into opportunities and to produce the power and energy for transformation, which at the moment is actually getting depleted by the survival crisis that COVID has brought. And a lot of our own efforts is to tell government that you have to energize these communities. You have to energize the entrepreneurial spirit that makes people survive in these terrible conditions by providing the infrastructure that only the state can provide. This is also a message to the global north with all its development assistance, is to not produce more aid for trade, which is what is happening today.
So you can see a more dark or light future for Mumbai?
Well, if you go by data and statistics, it is dark. If you go to those informal localities, the power of people's energies makes you believe it can change. But it requires space, resources, and assistance. So these are the contradictions that we are living with. And it's difficult to say black or white. It's all in gray right now. But we are a colorful nation, and so we believe that the power of people's energies will be transformative. We hope so.
Perfect. We hope so too. Thank you very much, Ms. Patel, for your speech, and thank you, Ms. Tretigeki, and you both have given us a lot of material to reflect on and to discuss with. Thank you. And now I give the floor to Stefania Sabatinelli, our discussant from Politecnico di Milano d'Astu. And Ms. Sabatinelli, while we look at the mosaic of all the picture bring by your panelists, can you give us a perspective about what we discussed today and how these topics can be related to Italy and Milan in particular?
Thanks a lot, Alessia, and thank you, Maria and Sheila. It was really interesting and fascinating to hear these two speeches from these two very different parts of the world, reminding us that even though scales of the issues are very different, as it was very clear in the speech by Sheila, still the issues that we are facing are the same globally, and the pandemic has shown this very clearly to us. A couple of things were very common across the two speeches. The idea that I also share that the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities and problems that were already there and has surely made them more evident, unveiled them, and made them more urgent and more serious. And I was hit by some words of one of our guests who said that the pandemic also destroyed the sense of trust and security. words that were counterbalanced by these last words by Sheila Patel, underlying the resilience that communities have shown. Also, Maria Stratigaki mentioned the term resilience, and this is very interesting. But resilience and all the energy that communities have showed over this more than a year now need support in order to be able to exploit their potential entirely. And I was also very, I really agree with the focus that both our guests put and the attention that they both put on some profiles of groups of population that inhabit our cities and who are the most hit by the issues that we are living, but also probably the ones through this energy can best flow if we put them in the best conditions for this to happen. And these profiles that both our guests mentioned are women, children and the young, and refugees and migrants, particularly forced migrants. Women and children and the most fragile profiles who live our cities, we always say this, but I think it's really true. If our cities are able to be friendly towards the most fragile of their inhabitants, then they are friendly towards everybody. And cities who are able to be friendly towards women and children will be cities of opportunities for everyone. They will be, in order to be more friendly toward women and towards children, they will need to be more accessible, safer, but also more enjoyable, more joyful, I would say, and become cities of opportunities in the true sense. As both our guests have highlighted, women and children were most hit by the effects of the lockdown, which were very, very long in some of our contexts, in Italy as well, and in Milan as well. Women have been hit more than the average through the loss of employment, because they are more often informally employed, and informal jobs are the first ones who were hit by the impossibility or by the need to reduce contacts on the one side, but also when and where they work in formal sectors, like it happens more often in Europe and in a city like Milan, they are more often employed in sectors that were hit the most by the closures. Restaurants, hotels, shops, all the women who work in these jobs who were stopped, and also all the women who are overrepresented in office works, in office jobs, who were not stopped, were asked to continue working in distance working, in home working conditions, and at the same time overburdened by care loads, which already in normal conditions are overwhelmingly on the shoulders of women, and which have been, this has been, of course, even more true in this pandemic year. And they have more than the average of the population spent long hours locked down in their homes, which are unequal in their features, together with children and young people who were either obliged to follow education at a distance with unequal means to access it, or deprived to poor of their possibility to be educated for long months. And we know that educational poverty is already a very serious issue, very present globally in some areas and in some contexts, but also very urgent in the richer countries and also in rich cities like Milan. And I already thought this before the pandemic burst, but now even more, educational poverty should be one of our main concerns. And I share with our guests that the way in which we are able and we will be able to build on the resources that communities have shown to have, supporting them and building the conditions for this to develop at the most, can be shown particularly in creating the conditions for children and young people to reappropriate of public spaces, of the cities at large, and at the same time, through this, be able to compensate for the educational opportunities that they have more or less lost over the past years. We can start, and we should start already in this summer 2021, creating the conditions for children and young people to get back together in bubbles, as Sheila was mentioning, in order to preserve safety conditions, of course, but at the same time take advantage of all the parts of the city that they have been obliged to forget over the past years, because I'm strongly convinced that being able to build a sense of belonging, not only in the very place where you happen to live, but in cities at large, even in very large cities, improves empowers us and improves our possibility to think of ourselves as citizens. And citizens means, thinking of ourselves as citizens means thinking of ourselves as bearers of rights and also of duties, and bearers of energies that we can share with our peers and with the other groups that build our societies and contribute and take care.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Battinelli. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessia.
And thank you, everybody, for being with us today. That's all for now. And thank you to our audience at home. See you on the next dialogue of Visible Cities on the topic loneliness cure, environmental fragilities and right to hold. Thank you very much.